When we think of beauty, we often imagine freedom, the power to express ourselves, to shine, to be admired. But in ancient China, beauty became a prison built not of walls or chains, but of silk wrappings, crushed bones, and silent suffering. This was the world of foot binding, one of history's most brutal practices, where a woman's worth was measured not by her mind or heart, but by the size of her feet. It began nearly 1,000 years ago during the Song dynasty. Court dancers were said to captivate emperors with their tiny lotus-shaped feet, gliding as if floating above the ground. What started as a rare fascination of the elite quickly spread like wildfire. Soon, every family that dreamed of climbing the social ladder felt the same unspoken pressure. Bind your daughter's feet, or she will never marry, never be respected, never belong. But beauty in this system was not natural. It was manufactured through agony. Girls as young as 4 or 5 were forced into the ritual. Their soft, developing feet were bent and folded, the arch broken, the toes curled beneath the sole until the entire foot was crushed into 3 inches of twisted bone. They called it the Golden Lotus. To us, it is unimaginable cruelty. Still, society praised it. A woman with bound feet was seen as delicate, refined, and worthy of a good match. Families boasted of daughters with the smallest lotus feet, as though her pain was a trophy. The cruel irony was that bound feet symbolized elegance, yet they robbed women of the ability to walk with freedom. Every step was agony, every movement a reminder that beauty had become a curse, and so women were chained in silence. The very act that crippled them became their only path to survival. Without bound feet, a girl was branded undesirable, destined for poverty or shame. With bound feet, she could marry, raise children, and bring honor to her family, but at the cost of her body and her freedom. What makes this even more haunting is that it wasn't strangers who carried out the ritual. It was done inside the home, behind closed doors, often by the women who loved the little girl most. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts. They were the ones who tied the bindings tighter each day, ignoring the cries and blood, believing they were securing her future. Imagine the scene. A child, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, sitting on a stool, her feet being wrapped tighter and tighter until her bones snap like brittle twigs, her tears falling silently, knowing there is no escape. She is too young to understand why, but old enough to feel the betrayal. This was not a single moment of pain. It was a daily ritual, repeated for years, reshaping her body and her destiny. And that's where the tragedy deepens. Because while society admired the beauty of the lotus, it ignored the voices of the little girls whose childhoods were stolen. The innocence of play, of running freely in the fields, of chasing dreams. All of it was crushed alongside their bones. Yet as horrifying as this sounds, this was only the beginning. What started with the breaking of a child's body would soon shape her entire future. The screams of childhood would transform into the silent burden of marriage. A marriage where her worth was not measured by love, but by the size of her broken feet. Picture a little girl, no more than 5 years old. Her world should be filled with laughter, games, and the joy of discovering life. But instead, she is led into a small room by her mother and grandmother, sat down on a low stool, and handed a bowl of warm water. She doesn't know it yet, but her childhood is about to end. The ritual begins with her tiny feet soaked until the skin softens. Then comes the cloth, long, strong strips of silk, meant not for decoration but for destruction. The toes are bent under, pressed so tightly against the sole that bones splinter and snap. The arch is forced upward, breaking again and again until the foot folds almost in half. With each pull of the binding, the child cries out in agony. But her cries are muffled, her pain dismissed as necessary. Because to her family, these screams are not cruelty. They are an investment in her future. And so the process repeats day after day, month after month. Every morning, the wrappings are tightened until fresh blood seeps through the silk. Toenails rot, flesh blackens, infections spread. Some girls lose toes entirely. Many die of sepsis before they even reach womanhood. But if she survives, if she endures the torment, her family believes she will be rewarded. She will one day be admired as graceful, beautiful, and worthy of a wealthy husband. The cost of this beauty is staggering. Childhood is stolen, play becomes impossible, and freedom is gone. Imagine trying to run with broken feet. Imagine trying to climb, dance, or chase a friend while your bones are crushed inside bloody bindings. For these girls, the joy of movement, something we take for granted, was replaced with a daily reminder that their bodies were no longer theirs. But the cruelest part was how early it all began. At an age when most children still cling to dolls and beg for bedtime stories, these girls were learning to swallow screams, to walk on shattered bones, to carry silence like a second skin. Their mothers whispered promises, "Endure this, and your future will be secure." Yet to a child, the future is too far away. All she knows is pain, and that pain followed her into every corner of life. Schooling, if she had any, was overshadowed by constant discomfort. Playtime was traded for recovery, and as she grew older, the bindings were tightened further to ensure the foot never returned to its natural shape. What began as a childhood ritual soon became a lifelong prison. But the torment of childhood was not the final cruelty. Because once a girl's feet were permanently reshaped, her fate was sealed. Her broken body was now her dowry, her entry ticket into marriage. And while many might think marriage was a relief from suffering, the truth was far more tragic. Marriage was not freedom. It was another kind of binding. By the time a girl reached marriageable age, her feet were no longer her own. They had been reshaped into the grotesque ideal of 3-inch golden lotuses. Every step was slow, painful, and deliberate. But to society this was considered elegant. A woman's awkward, swaying walk was not seen as a sign of disability. It was a symbol of grace, fragility, and desirability. And so, bound feet became more than just bones wrapped in silk. They became a woman's only ticket into marriage. Marriage in Imperial China was not built on love. It was a contract, a transaction between families, where a woman's worth was judged by her ability to bring honor, wealth, and sons. In this world, unbound feet were a curse. No matter how intelligent, kind, or capable a young woman was, she risked being discarded as unworthy if her feet were not small enough. Parents knew this, and so they bound their daughters not out of cruelty alone, but out of fear. Fear that without the lotus feet, their daughters would never find husbands and would doom the family's reputation. But what awaited these brides was no fairy tale. The wedding day, wrapped in red silk and ceremony, hid a life of confinement. Many women were carried to their new homes because walking was too painful. Once inside, they were expected to serve in-laws, manage households, and above all produce heirs, all while enduring the torment of crushed bones that never healed. And here lies the cruel paradox. Bound feet were supposed to symbolize status and beauty, yet they chained women to dependency. A bride with broken feet could not run away from an abusive husband. She could not work the fields if famine struck. She could not survive without her husband's household. What was called elegance was, in truth, a method of control, ensuring that women stayed tied to the home, unable to stray too far, physically or socially. Still, society romanticized the suffering. Poems praised wives with lotus feet as treasures, and husbands paraded their wives' bound feet as symbols of wealth and refinement. The reality, though, was far grimmer. Women lived lives of loneliness, limping from room to room, hiding infections, enduring whispers of pain with smiles that never reached their eyes. And yet, the most shocking part was not the suffering itself, but who continued to enforce it. Mothers, Women who had lived through the very torment themselves were often the ones who bound their daughters' feet, who tightened the cloth, who turned their children's cries into silence. Why would mothers, scarred by the same agony, pass it on to their daughters? It is easy to imagine that men alone drove the practice of foot binding, but the truth is far more complex and far more heartbreaking. In many households, it was not the father who carried out the binding ritual, it was the mother, the very person who once endured this torture herself, who still bore the scars and the limp, became the one to pass it on to her daughter. At first glance, this feels like betrayal. How could a mother who remembers the snapping of her own bones force her child to relive the same agony? But the reality was not simple cruelty, it was desperation. A mother knew that in a society obsessed with lotus feet, her daughter's entire future rested on the size of her steps. Without binding, no suitor would come. Without binding, she would be branded undesirable, unmarriageable, and left to a lifetime of poverty. So mothers did what they believed they had to do. In their eyes, they weren't destroying their daughters' lives. They were saving them. And so the cycle repeated. Generation after generation, women who had once been victims became enforcers, teaching their daughters how to wrap the silk, how to endure the pain without complaint, how to hide their infections with perfumes and powders. Some even sang lullabies while binding, as if soft words could soften the agony. It was a cruel contradiction. Love, expressed through suffering. But beneath that surface of tradition and survival was another layer of tragedy. Mothers did not only pass down the bindings, they passed down silence. Girls were taught not to scream too loudly, not to show their tears, not to speak of their pain. To cry was weakness, to endure was honor. In this way, obedience was woven into the bindings as tightly as silk itself. This generational cycle stripped women of solidarity. Instead of rebelling together, mothers and daughters were trapped in a system where love became entangled with cruelty. Mothers believed they were protecting their daughters from social ruin, but in truth they were ensuring that the cycle of torture never ended. And the irony was painful. Society admired women for their strength and suffering, while it was the very system of suffering that erased their strength. Mothers may have carried the key to breaking the chain, but the cost of rebellion was too high. Refusing to bind a daughter's feet meant condemning her to shame, ridicule, and rejection. No mother wanted that fate for her child. So the bindings continued, and the screams of daughters became echoes of their mother's past. The home, which should have been a place of safety, was the very place where pain was passed from one generation to the next. But enduring the ritual was only part of the torment. Once the feet were bound and childhood was gone, the suffering didn't stop. It followed women into every moment of their daily lives, turning the simplest acts, like standing or walking, into battles of endurance. By the time a woman reached adulthood, her bound feet had become permanent. The bones, once broken in twist, could never heal. Every day was a reminder of what had been stolen. To outsiders, she might appear graceful in her embroidered slippers, but each delicate step was a step through pain. Simple tasks became trials. Walking across a courtyard, standing for too long, even climbing a few stairs, all brought waves of agony. Some women developed infections so severe that the stench of rotting flesh followed them for life. Others lost toes, entire actions of their feet, or lived with constant pus and blood inside their bindings. Yet society never looked past the slippers. What people saw were not wounds, but beauty. What they praised was not her strength, but her silence. Daily life was built on endurance. To sweep a floor, cook a meal, or carry water was an ordeal. Yet expectations never lowered. A woman was to serve her household without complaint. If she faltered, she was ridiculed. If she showed pain, she was shamed. And if she dared to dream of another life, one where her body was her own, that dream was crushed like her bones. Worse still, humiliation often came not only from society, but from within her own home. A husband might boast of her tiny feet to guests, yet privately criticize her slowness. In-laws could mock her if her feet were not small enough. Even other women joined in, comparing foot size as if it were a competition. Pain was no longer private. It was measured, judged, and displayed as a badge of status. And yet, beneath this cruelty, women found ways to survive. They decorated their bindings with silk and flowers, turning cages into art. They learned to smile, to laugh, to mask their pain in conversation. But the cost of this survival was silence. A silence so heavy it stretched for centuries, muffling the cries of millions of women whose lives were never their own. This hidden suffering was perhaps the most devastating part of foot binding. Because it wasn't just about bones and skin, it was about identity. Women were reduced to symbols of beauty, obedience, and sacrifice, while their voices, their dreams, their individuality were erased. But history teaches us that even the deepest silence cannot last forever. Whispers of rebellion began to stir. Some women refused to bind their daughters' feet. Some men began to question why beauty demanded such cruelty. Slowly, those whispers grew louder, until entire movements demanded an end to the practice. The bindings that had lasted for centuries were finally beginning to loosen. But the question remained: could a society that had built its ideals on broken bones truly let go of its chains? For nearly 1,000 years, the practice of foot binding clung to China like a shadow. It had survived dynasties, wars, and even foreign invasions. But by the late 19th century, the world was changing, and so was China. Western visitors condemned the practice as barbaric. Missionaries wrote accounts of the horror, and reformers within China itself began to ask a dangerous question: why should beauty demand pain? The first voices of resistance came from unexpected places. Some Chinese scholars argued that bound feet weakened the nation, because crippled women could not work or contribute fully to society. Others insisted it was time to modernize, to break away from the old traditions that chained progress. Women's groups began to emerge, quietly encouraging mothers to leave their daughters' feet unbound. By the early 20th century, the movement had grown too loud to ignore. In 1912, with the fall of the Qing dynasty, the new Republic of China officially banned foot binding. Inspectors went door to door, demanding that women remove their bindings and allow their feet to grow naturally. But after centuries of fear and tradition, change did not happen overnight. Many families resisted, hiding their daughters' bindings in secret, terrified that without them their children would never marry. Still, the tide could not be stopped. Slowly, the golden lotus lost its power. Women began to walk unbound, to tan straighter, to reclaim what had been stolen from them. By the mid-20th century, foot binding had nearly disappeared, leaving behind only the survivors, elderly women, whose twisted feet told silent stories of what they had endured. And yet, even as the practice ended, its scars never fully healed. Generations of women had been robbed of their childhoods. Their freedom, their voices, their pain was buried beneath layers of silk and silence, rarely recorded in history books, rarely honored in monuments or stories. But when we look back today, the lesson is impossible to ignore. Foot binding was not about beauty. It was about control. It was about a society willing to sacrifice the freedom of its daughters in the name of tradition and status. And while the bindings may be gone, the question remains: how many times, in how many cultures, have we demanded that women suffer in the name of beauty? When we hear the phrase golden lotus, we must remember what it really meant. Not elegance but agony, not grace but chains. Behind every embroidered slipper was a story of endurance, of silent strength, of lives reshaped by forces beyond their control. And now, those voices can finally be heard. If this story has opened your eyes to a part of history rarely told, Make sure these forgotten women are not forgotten again. Share their story. Remember their pain. Because history is not just about emperors and battles, it is about the silenced, the broken, and the survivors who carried their scars into the future. So the next time someone tells you beauty is pain, remember the women who lived and died by that phrase, chained in beauty, yet longing for freedom. History often glorifies empires, emperors, but behind every so-called golden age, there are untold stories of pain. Silenced voices that history chose to forget. The women who lived and died with bound feet remind us that beauty, when twisted by society, can become its own form of torture. If their story moved you, don't let it vanish again. Hit the like button so more people can hear their voices. Subscribe for more hidden truths that textbooks never told you. And tell us in the comments, what shocked you the most about football? Because only when we speak about the forgotten can we finally give them the place they deserve in history.